Hello, and welcome to the first ever Forgeborn Hobbies Let's Paint video series. In this series, I will be showing you how to paint a Mortek guard miniature for the Ossiarch Bonereapers for Warhammer Age of Sigmar. Throughout this series, I'm going to show you the step-by-step process of how I take this model from being boring gray plastic and turn it into this. After this video goes live, I'm going to also post separate videos showing each individual step of the process. So if you just want to see how to paint one part of this miniature without having to see the whole thing, hopefully that will help you to do so without having to click through an entire video over and over again. I hope that you find this process enjoyable. I hope that this helps you as you paint your miniatures. Let's go ahead and get painting. Before we begin actually painting this miniature, I want to show you all of the stuff that I used during this process. Here in the background, you can see all of the paints, including the primer and the varnish that I use on this miniature. Over on the right, you can see the brushes that I use. The one on the very far right, you will see me use it first, and then I do switch it out for the orange one that you can see. Those are both fine detail brushes, somewhere in the 10-0, 5-0 range. I realized about halfway through painting with the older brush that it is now too old to use. I highly recommend that if you're going to get a fine detail brush, make sure you get one with a fine point. The other brushes that I use in this series will be a medium dry brush, a small dry brush, a medium layer brush, and a cheap synthetic brush that's probably about a size 1 in the standard brush sizing. And I use that for washes and for the contrast paint, things like that tend to destroy brushes. Throughout this series, I'm going to attempt to put the different paints on screen so that you can see what I'm using in each step, but I will also describe what I'm using as I go through. The only thing that is not on camera are the times that I use an airbrush. I didn't show those because it's really not necessary. This isn't an airbrushing tutorial. This is a tutorial on the paints and the order that I use them in. I do undercoat the model in Vallejo Surface Primer Black, and then I do a spray of matte varnish at the end before I do the gloss varnish. Those are both through an airbrush, very simple process. There are much better tutorials on how to do that part. Now that we've gone over the different materials that I'll be using, let's go on to the first step. Our first step here is that we're going to dry brush the entire model with Dawnstone. I'm going to do this straight over the black primer. I got a really good coat with this black primer, and so I didn't feel the need to put a base coat of any kind of black paint down. The primer itself will be perfect for this, and anywhere that may have needed a black on it, we can easily go back and fix later without it looking too dissimilar from a good black paint. If you've never dry brushed before, all you're going to do is load up the brush with some paint, get rid of some of it on a palette so that you have some control, and then you're going to wipe or brush most of the paint off onto a paper towel before drawing it across the miniature. Not pressing too hard onto the miniature itself is going to catch most of the detail. On this particular miniature, the edges are so sharp that it will actually catch and create a line highlight on almost the entire miniature with almost no effort. And it's pretty fantastic for this, especially painting an entire army using this color scheme. You'll see that at one point I do show the spear tip. When you're dry brushing, as long as you go perpendicular to the edge that you're dry brushing, it will catch any hard surface like this really well. It eliminates the need to go in and line highlight the blade. That is something that can take a lot of time, especially if you're doing this across like 20, 30, 40 miniatures for an army project. And as you can see here, the dry brush, way more than sufficient to accomplish this task. Once we finish dry brushing everything on this miniature, keep the Dawnstone out because we're going to continue to use it in the next step of this process. Now that we're done dry brushing the Dawnstone on, we're going to use it as a layer paint. We're going to put it onto the base. We're going to put it onto things like the feet, the ankles, the kneecaps, anything that would be soft armor, or things that seem like they would need to be flexible. This is how I make a distinction between the two different types of material that I want this Mortek guard to be made out of. We're also going to use Dawnstone on any of the trim that's going to go around the red armor later on, and you'll see me also use this on at least the wraps around the handle on the spear shaft. This is going to help with base coating the next color that we use later on. but it's really unnecessary if you don't want to do it. You'll see here that I mix a little bit of water into the Dawnstone. Mine just happens to be pretty thick because I mostly use it for dry brushing. You'll really want to do probably 1 or 2 layers of this at least. You do want a good solid layer of this, as later on when you're doing other things, you will use Dawnstone to clean up any mistakes that have been made, and you'll really want a solid color underneath it so that you can't tell that there's any kind of splotchiness or anything like that. Once this is done, we're going to move on to the next color, which is going to be Gray Seer, and that's going to really start to punch up some of these details and start to feel like we're actually making progress on this model. Alright, using the Gray Seer and a small dry brush, we are going to do the exact same thing that we did in the previous step. I'm going to take some of the Gray Seer, dry brush it onto every edge of this model, including over the areas that we painted in Dawnstone last time and the areas that were left that darker gray-black mix. This is going to really make the highlights pop. It's also going to add highlights to the gray areas, and it's going to show us more of the detail for when we do the layering of Gray Seer, which we'll do right after this. So essentially, this step and the step before it are exactly the same. We're doing a dry brush with this color, and then we're doing a layer with this color on the things that we will need to do in future steps. In this case, the things that we layer with Gray Seer, we're not going to dry brush with anything. We're going to let washes and shades take care of the rest of the stuff on those. Now the thing with Gray Seer is that even though it is a base paint and it covers really well, in order to get the really smooth finish that makes contrast paint work with it, I do thin it with a little bit of water, and I do paint on a couple thin coats. This will help the color to be really strong and consistent across areas like the cloth, the spear shaft, and the eyes, which are the 3 things that mainly just get this layer. Everything else is hit with the dry brush. And as a final note, if you're wondering why dry brush and then layer, it's because the dry brush can leave kind of a chalky finish, and it can leave just little bits of paint on the surface of the model. And by doing the layer over top of it, it helps to clean that off and to leave a better finish for the next step. So to me, it just feels like that is a good order to do things to get a good finish in the end. We're going to take a little bit of an intermission here, and I'm going to show you the steps that I take when I need to clean up this miniature. Sometimes the dry brushing goes a little bit too far, or while putting on the Gray Seer or the Dawnstone, it gets on an area where it wasn't supposed to be put. This is going to happen especially painting a lot of these at a time. When I painted this army, it was 20 models at a time, plus a character, plus something else, and going really fast, and you get some paint where it's not supposed to go. In order to clean this up, I'm going to use Black Templar Contrast. I have thinned this with equal parts water, so it is a very thin mix. It's not going to pave like traditional contrast will, but it will definitely do what it needs to do to restore the black color where it's supposed to go. All I'm going to do is use my medium layer brush to apply this as a wash over the surfaces where it needs to go. I'll show a couple of these in this clip. Some of the big areas that stood out to me were the upper back, the butt of the spear where I got some Gray Seer on it, and the flats of the spear tip where I just wanted to make sure that the black was really solid right there, and you can easily do that with Black Templar by just running it across the flat of the blade. It will naturally avoid those edges and will keep that crisp highlight. It just makes the next few steps really easy. I've also taken the opportunity where I needed to in future steps to either use this or Dawnstone or Gray Seer to touch things up before moving on to the next step. And I'm not going to show that here just for the sake of time, but I do that often. It is okay to do that. I know it doesn't get shown very often. It is okay to do. It's good practice as you are painting these minis, especially as you start to pick up speed in painting them. Okay, now for the fun part. We're going to paint the red on this miniature. We're going to start off with Gal Vorbak Red, which is a pretty thin paint, and it's going to need several coats, especially if you're doing this over a black undercoat. This is only going on the armor panels. So there's the chest piece, there's the shoulder guards, and then there's the main body of the shield. Once the Galvorback red is done, we are going to move on to Wordbearer's red. This is a much lighter red, but it's the same kind of tone. And I'm going to layer this on the half of each of the panels, going from the highest point down. So this will mostly make it look like a very blocky layer highlight, and that's okay. This will also take a couple of coats to get right, just to make sure that the red is really strong and ready for the final highlight. The last highlight that's going to go on here is just a very edge highlight or a very thin line highlight if needed of Mephiston red. This is the brightest the red is going to get, and by putting it just on the edges, once we do the final wash on here, it will really stand out as a bright red on the edges going down into a very dark red. Once we get the final wash on here, it's going to even out and really sell the depth of this color, leaving that bright red highlight on the edge just to catch whatever little light there would be hitting this model in the environment that it's set in. This is pretty much it for the red until we do the final wash of the gray at the very last step. With the red done, we are now ready to move on to the blue. This is the next of what are my favorite parts of this color scheme, and while this is the easiest thing to paint on here, besides the dry brushing, this will actually take quite a few minutes for me to show you how to do this properly. There's not many steps involved, but I want to make sure to explain this to you so that if you try to do this on your own, you get similar results to me. So what you will see here is that I have contrast Talisar blue. This is going to do almost all of the work in achieving this effect, and we are going to take some of this and we are going to treat this like a glaze, not as a wash like you would normally do with contrast paints. What you don't see here is that while I've put some on my brush, I've also wiped a little bit off on the palette just so that it is not running off of this in too heavy of a flow. I just want enough on here to glaze over the top of this spear blade right here that you can see. And I'm going to do this to the spear tip on both sides. I'm also going to do this to the eyes, and I'm going to do it on the gem on the chest. What I don't show here is that there's these two little gems that are on either side of where the tabard attaches to the belt, and I'm going to get those later once I realize that I've missed them. You can see that I'm putting Talisar blue into the eyes, and I'm not doing that because I'm going to give them the same gem effect as I will give everything else on the model. I'm actually putting that on there because I want the eyes to be glowing blue. That's a part of the scheme. There's nothing on this model that helps to illustrate that as much, but on things like spirit hosts or anything that would be like magical glowing effects across the army that this goes with, I painted those in a blue scheme that looks like a shadowy blue. And just putting this layer of contrast blue over these eyes helps to sell that effect as well. And when I get to the last part and I don't gloss varnish it, it will show up even better that that is a different material or a different effect to what we're going for. Once all of the Talisar blue is dry, I'm going to take Lothern blue and I'm going to treat it like a simple edge highlight. Only on this, I'm only going to go wherever the sharpest tips of things are. So here, just on the end of the blade and just on the part that would be the most upward facing tip where the light would most catch on a very glossy object. I'm going to do this on a couple different parts. Here on the cartouche, which I had also done and forgot to mention earlier, I'm going to do this on most of the edges just because it is such a small detail and it really does need extra highlighting even on the parts that aren't edges that point upwards. So that just helps on this particular piece to sell that effect, but everywhere else I'm a lot more selective with what gets highlighted. After the Lothern blue is on, there's actually nothing else that we are going to do to the blue until the very last step when we put the gloss varnish on, and I will show you that towards the end of this video. Now that the blue is done, the next step is to do the cloth. On this Mortek guard, there are two areas of cloth. There's the tabard, and there's the haft of the spear. If you look on my Instagram, you'll see that the spear hafts and the sword handles and things like that are painted the same red as the armor. That was an accidental stylistic choice that I didn't actually intend to do on those, but that I didn't really think about until I was most of the way through my first unit of Mortek guard, and I thought, you know what, forget it. I'll just finish what's here and pretend like I meant to do it. What I had actually intended to do was to paint the spear hafts and the handles and things like that to match tabard so that that color kind of showed up in 2 different places. So I'm going to show you how I did that here, and it actually ended up turning out pretty well. I hadn't actually practiced this on anything else before I did this recording. I just kind of hoped that the extra length on this spear haft and the extra length that this technique would have to go would work out, and it did. So I'm taking Space Wolves Gray, which is another contrast paint, and I'm painting it very heavily just onto the top half of the cloth. So you can see here I actually flipped the model upside down, and that's because I want the darkest part to be the part closest to the actual waist of the model. I want it to get lighter as it goes down towards the ground. I don't want the Space Wolves Gray to pool anywhere near the bottom of the tabard. So as I do this, I end up actually filling this with a lot more contrast than probably I needed to, but in this case it wasn't getting the coverage that I really wanted, and it just took a few tries. If I wasn't so impatient, I probably would have waited for this coat to dry and then done another coat, but I was really worried about the gradient that it would create, because if this is done right, and how this has normally gone on my Mortek guard in the past, I can do this in just one layer and the gradient looks really good. You'll see that, ironically, this actually works a lot better on the spear haft than it does on the tabard, and I'm not really sure why, but it works out pretty well. So you can see here on the spear, I do the contrast paint on the half of the spear that is above the hand, and then I kind of realize, yeah, that's not going to look great. It's going to look like there are just 2 halves to this, so I end up doing some more beneath the hand, and then clean my brush off, and I'm going to use just a moist brush and flick away some of the paint that's on there, and that's going to really help to smooth out that gradient. It's going to take a couple passes. I'm going to have to go back and forth between a clean brush and the contrast paint a few times in order to make this work the way it's supposed to, but it ends up being really easy. It's just something where it takes a little bit more effort than if I had just painted the entire thing in the contrast paint. Once this is done, it's going to be ready for that final step that we're going to get to in just a few minutes. For the base of this model, I have given it the same kind of treatment as I gave the rest of the model earlier in this process. It has been given a base coat of Dawnstone and a dry brush of Grey Seer. We're going to give this a wash of Agrax Earthshade, just straight out of the pot, no thinning, nothing like that. I'm going to do a thinner layer of this. I'm not going to just slap it on there. I want to keep as much of the gray as I can and just give it a tone and fill in just the most recessed parts. This is going to give it a brown tone that's still going to keep some of the gray, that's going to make a really good backdrop for the rest of this model. This is the easiest part of the process, and the hardest part is just keeping the Agrax Earthshade away from the feet. If you do get any on the feet, it's fine. The wash that we're going to do over the entire model after this is going to fix most of that anyways. It's not that big of a deal, but you know, it's a good practice to be clean with this. Once the Agrax Earthshade is completely dry, we're going to move on to the all-over wash, which is the last real painting step of this model. Alright, in this step we're going to tie everything together. I'm going to use a custom mix of Basilicanum Gray and Contrast Medium to wash almost this entire model from head to toe. This is going to create all of the shading. It's also going to help blend some of the layers together that we've done before, and ultimately it's going to give the effect that we're going for on this model. So I'm going to explain how this contrast mix works and talk you through that, and then I'll show you actually applying it to the miniature itself. This contrast paint mix that I have is, this contrast mix is 2 full bottles of contrast medium and 1 full bottle of Basilicanum Gray contrast paint. I do this in such a large batch because it means I don't have to eyeball any mixes, and when you're working on an entire army project, if you know that you're going to use a certain mix over and over again, it's easier to just mix up an entire batch that you can use. So that's what I've done here. It gives me 48 milliliters total of this wash, and this does apply just like a wash. So I tend to go through this pretty quick. I think the bottle that I show here is either the second or the third bottle that I used on this entire army, and as you can see, we're getting close to the end on it. So it did its job. It meant that I didn't have to keep trying to mix every time I painted a unit or a single model. I could just break this out and go for it. This mix is about a 2.5 to 1 mix at the end based on the amount of liquid that's in each bottle. And what this is going to do is it's going to supercharge the contrast properties of the Basilicanum Gray. It's going to make it so that there's almost no staining of the upper parts of the miniature, especially the more highly textured parts like the cloth on the spear, things like that. This mix is going to make the gray just sit in the recesses for the most part. On more of the flatter surfaces, like the armor panels and some of the darker bone segments, this is going to sit less in the recesses and is going to spread out a little bit more like a contrast paint would, but it's still going to avoid the most sharp edges, and that's going to help with blending the different layers of either the dry brushing or the different reds that we're using together, and it's going to look great. I'm really excited for how this turned out, and I think when people see this model, they think that I've done a lot more work than I've actually done on these, and it's really just down to this wash and basic painting skills. So how this works is you load up a brush with the contrast medium mix, put it pretty liberally over the entire model except for the blue and the base. Everything else gets this. You can even put this on the eyes. I did because that's what helps tie it in with the magical blue glowing shadow effect that I went for on other models. And if you want to know more of what that actually looks like, just check out my Instagram and look for any of the glowing ghosts or things like that to see what that does. But it's fine if this gets on the entire face. I don't make any effort to be clean in this step. The only thing that I would recommend is once you've done the head to toe thing and the whole model is covered, you're going to want to clean off the brush, and you're going to want to go back and you're going to soak up places where this maybe sat too much, and you do that so that it doesn't clog up any details and so that the contrast paint doesn't pool over things, which I've noticed it has a tendency to do because of I'm guessing the tensile properties of the contrast medium. So in order to avoid that, I do clean this up a little bit where I need to, but otherwise I try to let every surface get touched by this. This is going to take a really long time to dry. So I know when I painted this for this video, I put it on there and I went and did chores around the house, made dinner, ate dinner, watched a TV show, came back in a little over 2 hours, and it was just barely dry. So give this a long time to dry. Give it a long time to do its thing. You'll know it's dry when it has more of a satin finish. That's a weird thing about contrast paint, that it doesn't have the same matte finish as traditional paints unless you do a really thin glaze with it. If you do it actually as a wash, it will have a satin finish when it's dry. And finally, once this is dry, we're almost done. Just have a couple last things to do just to tie everything together and complete this Mortek garden miniature. And now, finally, we are on the very last step. This is the everything coming together, doing the varnishing, finishing up the base step. You will see here that I have actually skipped ahead quite a bit in the process. I don't need to show you some of these things. They're pretty simple and they're not really anything special. In this case, I've taken the model off of the painting handle and I've used some poster putty to stick it onto this wooden block to give me access to the edge of the base. I've also glued on the shield with some super glue, and I have glued on some Army Painter Deadland tufts to the base to add some texture and to add a little bit of dimension to the base. And I've also painted the edge of the base with Abaddon Black. After finishing all of that, I've sprayed this model with a couple coats of matte varnish from Vallejo just to make sure it gets good coverage through the airbrush. Matte varnish is a really tricky thing to use sometimes, and you don't want to overdo it because it can give you a frosting effect, and we want to avoid that. I then let the matte varnish dry for a good while just to make sure that it had hardened and fully dried, and now we're going to do the very, 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 very last step, which is the gloss varnish. This is going to go on anything that is blue except the eyes. So we're looking at the tip of the spear, the cartouche on the shield, the gemstone on the chest, and the 2 gemstones on the tabard. I do a couple of thin coats of gloss varnish and make sure that the layers have a few minutes to dry in between. That's just to make sure that it doesn't build up too thickly. When you put gloss varnish on too thick, it goops up and it has a really bad effect. I made the mistake of doing that on a couple other models in this collection, and there's really no way to fix it without just trying to strip the model. So be careful of how thickly you put on gloss varnish onto things. And once the gloss varnish is dried, we're done. Let's go see what this looks like on the display stand. And here we have the completed Mortek guard miniature. At the end of all of this, I hope that you found this helpful for you. I hope that you've seen a new technique, a new way of painting, maybe just a new color scheme that interests you and that will be helpful for you in your own painting adventures. If you like what you see, please hit that like button down below. And if you'd like to leave a comment, question, any gentle advice for how I can do these videos better in the future, I would really appreciate that as well. This is my first YouTube video. I am working on editing, I'm working on sound design, working on recording. This is another of the Forgeborn Hobbies skill set that hopefully will improve over time. So bear with me if this wasn't the best quality. It will get better, I promise you. If you'd like to see more of my work, head to my Instagram page. I'll put a link to it down in the description below. But other than that, please take care, stay safe, and most importantly, keep painting.